pleasure that we are holding 22nd session of our International Teaching Month. And today's topic is very, very vibrant. That is artificial intelligence and international law, a possible subject status. So to deliver this session, we have with us Dr. Andras Hars. On behalf of Institute of Law, I welcome Professor Andras Hars today for this session. Let me introduce all of you to Professor Andras Hars. He is a lecturer at Ludovika-University of Public Services in Budapest, Hungary. He holds a doctoral degree in public international law in the field of UN peacekeeping. He has an experience of more than 8 years in higher education teaching. He has taught courses like international law, international relations, diplomatic and consular relations, international organizations, United Nations, peacekeeping, among others. He has also delivered various guest lectures in various jurisdictions like India, like Spain, Sudan, Netherlands, as well as he had a lot of publications in this area. So it's an honor that we have such a great expert in international law, specifically to address artificial intelligence. I welcome Professor Andras Hars, and I hope this session would be very, very interactive. Before I give mic to Professor Andras Hars, I request all of you to please keep your Zoom Zoom mic on switch off mode and keep your cameras on. Professor will speak for around 45 to 50 minutes, and then after that we will have some questions. So if you have any question in between, you can type on my chat box and we will take your question in last few minutes. With this, I hand over to Professor Andras Hars.
Thank you very much for the kind words and the professional introduction. And also, I would like to thank Dean Parikh, Professor Srivastava, and Professor Kashyap for the invitation and for organizing this wonderful event. It is my pleasure to be virtually, though, at Nirma University in Ahmedabad. So in my head, I picture myself that I'm sitting together with you in a very comfortable classroom, as we have had a couple of years ago. So there is a seeming discrepancy if you read my CV on my CV or between my CV and my subject status, as I have previously been working with UN peace operations. So this is a relatively new field of study for me, a very new field of research which I am delving into. Basically, the idea for the research came exactly here at Nirma University. During the inaugural ceremony of the Artificial Intelligence Research Center, where I have been pondering on the idea of what international law can do with this subject. And what I have found is that this is basically an uncharted gold mine with lots of avenues, lots of possibilities for research and also for study. So this is one of the key areas where if you would like to be involved in some future research in developing what we know about our current understanding of artificial intelligence and the future of law itself, then this is one of the key areas where you should be focusing at. And I would highly recommend working on this field or working in relationship with this field, because it is very vast. It is relatively unresearched, but it is getting very popular. So without further ado, let's get into the subject matter at hand. If you think about artificial intelligence and international law, then you can think of a lot of things and you might have a lot of questions. Artificial intelligence is, of course, a very prevalent aspect of our everyday lives. It is present in biomedics, data processing, social media, and whatever. But do we have any international agreements or international regulation on the subject? Well, the answer is both yes and no. We have several initiatives. We have several soft law documents. We have several states, international organizations, NGOs promoting some sort of cooperation on the subject, but we do not have a vast international treaty like we have regarding the law of treaties or diplomatic or consular relations, or even a consensus like we have regarding the norms on responsibility in international law. However, there will be lots and lots of areas where these two areas will merge, and I would highly advise and I will encourage you to think about these issues on your own. And then if you have any questions, I'm here. Feel free to ask them. Bear in mind, however, that I'm no IT expert. I do not know the programming languages. I'm purely approaching this from an international law standpoint. So I'm not an expert in coding or whatever, merely the theoretical and research parts. So how do we understand AI in the first place? Well, in order to understand this and to have a firm grasp on the subject, we need to define what AI is. The terminology can be sometimes flexible. Of course, this is a field where our common understanding is going to be quite full of fear. So there's a palpable fear, not just in the international community, but on the individual level of our understanding of AI. We depict the thinking machines, as we've seen in several science fiction universes, ranging from Dune to the Terminator and Matrix franchises. We have lots of fear of what AI can do to us. And we mix the terminology of AI and robot a bit. To put it very simply, the robot is the machine, it is the hardware, and the AI is the program, it is the software. So this is the expression that we are going to do. And the whole field that deals with artificial intelligence is basically a sub-segment of computer sciences, which either deals with the machine learning aspects, if you have learned about the AlphaGo or the Sophia technologies, or the very intelligent chatbots, the chess programs capable of beating, for example, world champion Garry Kasparov in chess, then these are the programs that are based on machine learning. If you have ever submitted, for example, some tax returns, and you have filled out online surveys, well, some of those are based on the so-called logical rules and knowledge representation systems. So these are the these are the systems that require some minimal input, and then they will guide you towards an oriented decision-making process. And then you can have some hybrid systems also involved. We have the self-driving vehicles that are causing a lot of problems, but are maybe the key to move forward regarding public transportation. Which do have some machine learning. They learn as they go, they learn as they drive, but they also have some very strict logical rules. For example, the safety of a human life being paramount. And this has to be somewhat coded into their systems. How these two systems collide, well, these are the ones causing problems and some headaches for the programmers themselves. And then, of course, there's the human-guided systems, like the semi-autonomous weapon systems and the unmanned aerial vehicles, or drones, that are more commonly called. So how intelligent is our AI? Well, the short answer is that it is not. It is basically not intelligent in the current human understanding. It can learn within that small little sphere that it was created to do so. It will not understand strategy. It will not conceptualize abstract definitions. It will not have an understanding of, for example, the freedom or the right to free speech. It will not have these deep concepts that we are learning, for example, in law schools. It can, and this is what we see, it can have an expertise in taxes, because that's a closed system. It can be very adept at some computer games, like, for example, I think it has beaten the StarCraft world champion even, or the chess world champions, because those are closed systems, lots of possibilities, but they cannot think outside of the box. And that is why they are good. Our current intelligence, the adaptability of our species, it remains unique. So this is something that is not inherent to AI, that hasn't been programmed to AI. And we'll see shortly whether this is possible at all to be embedded into the AI systems. So our current legal understanding of AI is that these are things. These are created by humans, and these belong to humans. So ultimately, when it comes to, for example, responsibility, the creator is going to have ownership. Of course, that ownership can be transferred to other individuals, like from the creator, from the programmer, from the factory that manufactures it, to the individual maintenance personnel, or to the owner when it comes to the car, if it overrides, for example, the rules. So these are categorized as race in the Latin terminology, or simply products. These are something to be sold, to be bought. These do not have rights. So, for example, we have AI algorithms currently that are capable of creating music, that are capable of creating paintings. they will not be the owners of those paintings, but the one who has the license for the program will be the one who will be having ownership of the end result of the product. They themselves cannot obtain money or any other positive or negative consequences, which will mean that they also can be responsible for their own conduct. So it both works two ways. So right now we can say that our ownership of them is like owning a thing, owning a pen, owning a car, or owning something, which will also mean that everything they create will belong to us, which is, of course, akin to some semblance of slavery. But why isn't this a problem? Why don't human rights groups vastly protesting this turn of events? It is because, as I have said, the AI does not have a conception of slavery. They do not have workers' rights. They do not have the freedom to go on a break when they are tired, because they're not getting tired. They simply get replaced, and it does not cause any emotional or financial duress for them as it would for humans. So the concept of slavery and the ownership is basically non-applicable in this concept. So seeing how relatively simplistic our current regulation is, we can see that this is the basically the lack of overall control over the international community's response. We do not have a coherent international response to this phenomenon, but there are several sectoral regulations that have emerged quite recently. We have seen some very good research initiatives that aim to facilitate research. You might have seen when you're writing a thesis or a paper for a class that you can now just quickly search the Google Scholar database or the Hein Online or the numerous other databases, and you do not need to go to the library to check dusty books, because lots of materials are now digitalized. This is a very smart research engine and research database which can help facilitate research. It can speed it up significantly, and the uses of it are, of course, huge. International cooperation regarding research was prevalent starting 2 years ago during the coronavirus pandemic. Sharing research knowledge worldwide was one of the key reasons that we now have vaccination, that we now have jabs to keep the population safe as well. Where international law is concerned, of course, I would only highlight a few areas which have been undergoing some semblance of development. For example, regarding international humanitarian law, with the automated and semi-automated defense structures, satellite defense systems, and drones, which are creating quite a lot of trouble for the regulators. The ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, has begun a drafting process that aims at limiting the possibility of a fully automated defense installations, and they are allowing the semi-automated defense structures currently. But as I've said, that is not an international treaty. That is merely a sectoral regulation that is currently being proposed and drafted in Geneva. And if you have seen the Stop Killer Robots campaign, then this is one of the key areas where they are also active. One of the vastest, the most robust fields is, of course, human rights and the norms on free speech. The currently usable AI chatbots and algorithms which are learning from social media, for example, are having issues regarding human rights. Of course, free speech is a human concept. The AI does not benefit from it, but of course, free speech is not without limits. You cannot use hate speech. You cannot incite others to destroy groups. However, this is what the human race looks like. So when the AI is learning from the social media platforms, it will inevitably pick up misogynistic, racist, homophobic remarks and incorporate it into its own responses. And it will behave like that. Whether it's a bias, whether it's a human function that is inevitable, is still debated, but this is basically a serious human rights issue that will have to be regulated in some way if we want to create a decent and fair environment regarding the AI chatbots. And of course, legal practice. A few years ago, exactly at near my university, some wonderful presenters were highlighting the issue, who are practicing lawyers, that indeed the legal profession is changing. It is changing quite a lot. the more manual tasks of, for example, registering a company, filling out forms, distributing it, going to the post office, is getting done by algorithms, basically. So these are some easier to use AI systems that are replacing some of the jobs. This does not mean that the legal profession is going to be redundant, that we will not have jobs in a few years. This merely means that as a legal professional, you will be required to use these programs to operate them proficiently, and to outsource basically your job, the easier parts of your job, to AI systems, and then you will retain the thinking parts, the strategic concepts, how to build up your speech, for example, when you are arguing before a court, how to convince your clients to do this and that is in their interests. So the interesting parts will remain, and the manual labor part is going to be outsourced to AI systems. Intellectual property law, that is of course somewhat internationalized, as we have lots and lots of regulations regarding intellectual property. Copyrights and patent law is currently developing at a very fast rate. So this is one of the most developing parts on the international theater that is dealing with AI. And of course, the self-driving vehicles of Elon Musk's Tesla and other corporations are driving the way forward. It is sponsoring also lots and lots of research on how to make the responsibility issue quite prevalent. And I have not mentioned it yet, but sector regulation also exists. And besides sector regulation, regional regulation also is quite important. And in this respect, the European Union is the one that is not very advanced in developing AI technologies, because that falls to the US and to the Far East. But the EU is one of the most avid regulators on the issue, and they have norms on the ethics of AI, on the responsibility of AI, and they have very briefly touched upon the legal personality of AI systems as well. So this is also some area where regulation is going to be paramount, partly because AI run vehicles, or the self-driving vehicles, are manufactured in one part of the world and then they are distributed to another. So some international cooperation is of course quite necessary there. So we are slowly arriving to the level of public international law. And when it comes to public international law, you can see that, of course, the subjects are somewhat constant. We still have a system where the states are the paramount formulators of international norms. By now, international organizations such as the United Nations are also coming online from the, well, for the UN, it was from 1945, but for other regulatory international organizations, it was the second half of the 20th century. But states are remaining to be the paramount force from the basically from the system of the peace treaties of Westphalia. However, there are other special subjects that are emerging in international law. We do know that individuals, for example, can also be subjects of international law, either from a human rights standpoint or from an international criminal law standpoint when they're violating international norms. Then their responsibility will come directly from international law. And there are others, other special subjects, like, for example, humanity or mankind itself, to be more precise, regarding the common heritage of mankind as a special subject of international law. But there are other subjects that are slowly beginning to arrive. I wouldn't say that these are currently subjects of international law, but these are granted some sort of legal personality in their own legal system. And that legal personality is getting transferred to a certain extent to international law. For example, transnational companies, it is, of course, by now a quite known phenomenon that some of these national companies like Google or Meta right now are having a larger GDP than a lot of the countries in the world, and they can influence international processes to a substantial degree. So it stands to reason that because of their influence, they should be regulated somehow. NGOs, for example, like Human Rights Watch, are also able to shape the events of international law, but they are not yet having a subject status. But as we're going to see, there are others that are creeping into the field of international law. And if you see a whole timeline, as I have tried to present it, then this is a very rapid process. So international law As a law, it is always following societal movements, but altogether, it is getting there, and its processes are also getting faster and faster. So if we were to understand AI as a subject of international laws regulation, then how can we understand it? What is the absolute requirement for it to be regarded as a subject? It can be established that simply if you are a protected entity, that is not sufficient. So wildlife, for example, is a prime example. We have numerous international treaties on the protection of wildlife, but we do not say that the animal kingdom is a subject of international law. They have a very special status as a protected entity, but that does not make them a subject. So that is one extreme end of the scale. The other one is the ethical threshold to be reached, and that is self-awareness. This is something that we are fearing in terms of AI, whether they will become self-aware and they will outsmart us, they will, regarding their development, reach a higher level of consciousness, and they will rise up and basically take our seat as the dominant leading power on the globe. We are not really there, so this exists in science fiction, but we are very, very far from there. So when this happens, of course, regulation will be necessary, but if we arrive there regarding our current understanding of the international regulation, that might be too late. So we'll not, most likely will not have time to regulate. Most likely AI will regulate us if it ever reaches that point. So this self-awareness basically is the far end. When we are reaching this far end, so what are those middle stages that will arrive? The first major stumbling block for AI to reach is basically the superintelligence or general intelligence or singularity, as it is called. And what this means is that when the common or the culminated knowledge of AI will outrank or outweigh the collective human knowledge of things. So this will require, of course, a combined AI database, which currently does not exist or not made public. And that AI's capacity to think, to make logical deductions of the outside world will be larger than ours. We're not there yet. There are, of course, very, let's say, futuristic predictions that we are a few years from now. I will not be able to guess it, as I'm not a computer scientist by myself, but there have been several surveys, which had a very large number of computer science experts that have been asked, one in 2014 and one in 2018. The first one with roughly 500 experts from various countries asked, and the other one was from 350 surveys from the most renowned AI experts on the field. And they said that for us to reach the superintelligence phase will roughly take about between 28 and 76 years. Now, this is a very large amount of years that lie between it. So the average would be about 47-ish something, or maybe around 50. Why do we have such a large difference? Well, it depends on where the expert lives. If we ask European experts, North American experts, then they will say that it is closer to 76 years. If you ask experts from, for example, China, from, for example, India, Japan, South Korea, those who are actually leading AI research, they will say that we are much nearer to this. So they are much more progressive in this thought, and they will say that it is around 28 years. So based on our average lifespans, I think it is safe to assume that we will experience the emergence of a general intelligence that can that can combine more knowledge than what we have today. However, this is a general prognosis. And 50% of the experts said that we might never reach the stage of super intelligence. So basically, this is at this point, to our current knowledge in 2022, a coin toss whether we will reach that phase or not. And if we do, it will be roughly in about 45 to 50 years, depending on your perspectives, depending on your background, and depending on your positivity, basically, on the issue. Now, what about our fears? Of course, we fear that when AI will reach this phase, then they might take over, they might have some negative effects on the human population. Well, those who are actually seeing these scenarios and who are driving research and trying to think about all the possible consequences say that there's a 15% chance for that to be a bad phenomenon or a catastrophically bad phenomenon. So it is not very likely, but of course 15% is quite a risk. So this is something that will have to be analyzed, it will have to be regulated, and this is where lawyers and of course international lawyers will have a role to play in the future. Because, but this is just my point, it is not enough to react to these things. In terms of AI, we also have to be somewhat proactive, and we'll have to think about what this means for us, and we have to have some sort of regulation in place when we reach this stage. But of course, it's easier said than done. The players on the international field are not exactly motivated by the proactive mindset. They are wise in hindsight most of the time. So if the regulator would decide to have this brought to the international level and to provide, for example, some sort of a legal personality to AI, then what are the avenues? Well, basically, we have lots and lots of possibilities. I have narrowed it down to 3 main categories that can be applied here. Basically, we can either treat them as individuals, we can treat them as a separate sort of entity, or we can have some sort of halfway status. Let's see the first one and what it means. If we treat them as individuals, then that would require that AI has reached the stage where it is capable of thinking and acting like humans. There are various tests to determine whether AI has reached this stage. The most common one is the so-called Turing test, designed by Alan Turing roughly a half century ago, which stipulates that AI will reach the intelligent stage if it can deceive an interviewer when it talks to the AI into believing that it actually talks with a human person. Now, we have reached this stage already, but this does not mean that AI can think and act like a human. It can, as I mentioned, it can act and think in that box. It can also develop its ways of responding through machine learning, but it cannot, of course, right now develop conscience, and it is not capable of acting, of manipulating its circumstances as a human does. It can solve the most difficult mathematical equations in half a second, but it cannot also switch the lights on and off if it is not connected to that system. Whereas I can, theoretically at least, stand up from my desk and just switch it off. So what is very simple to us can be very difficult for an AI technology. However, this might not be the most prudent way to move forward, as it would require settling lots and lots of things for which there is most likely no consensus, even in the small state-bound societies that we live in. The questions of marriage, slavery, voting are, of course, quite problematic. Just think about voting, for example. If you can manufacture voters in a factory that are capable of having a conscience and capable of acting and thinking like humans, of course, the whole norms on voting will have to be changed fundamentally for that to apply. So this is futuristic, and this is basically a phantasmal concept that is not going to work. However, it has been proposed in Japan to allow, for example, marriage between a human and an AI in a robotic body. So that is something that some cultures are experimenting with, but that is not the rule, that is the expression, and that is basically unregulated at this point. Saudi Arabia, for example, is or has also provided a citizenship permit, or basically a citizenship by itself to an AI. However, that was also let's say, a show of the progressive nature of research in Saudi Arabia, and not as a large-scale domestic regulation providing AI with these norms. Of course, if you are familiar with Saudi Arabia, you will know that getting citizenship in Saudi Arabia as a human, it is quite difficult. For the AI, it was one singular case, and that is it. So what are some other possibilities that are emerging in international law? We can treat them as inanimate objects, which they are currently, which will mean that they will have their own standing, they will have their own rights, and maybe they will have some obligations, but that is a gray area currently. So what is this, and how does this look like? Well, in India, there are, of course, quite fine examples of rivers having a distinct legal personality. We have examples in New Zealand of a national park having its own legal personality. And there are several states in Latin America, namely Ecuador and Bolivia, which are progressing the protection of Mother Earth or Mother Nature in their own domestic frameworks. For example, Ecuador says that Pachamama or Gaia or Mother Earth will have some sort of special status before the courts, before tribunals, which will mean from a legal perspective that those individuals who are trying to protect the interests of Mother Earth can act in the interest of Mother Earth before these courts, according to the Constitution of Ecuador from 2008. Bolivia took this one step further, and they said that in 2010 they will establish an Earth Rights Declaration and Tribunal, which means a self-law document and a sort of a judicial body. Now, the tribunal name might be somewhat deceiving. It is not an actual court system. It is an advisory body that is required to issue some soft law documents and some issues that can be best translated as advisory opinions, for example, when drawn into a contrast with the International Court of Justice. So they will aim at regulating the lawmakers when it comes to the protection of Mother Earth. Now, this means that this is, of course, locally available. And when it is to be transferred to international law, we will see some problems. For example, a legal status would require having rights and obligations. In this context, this will only mean rights. So a protected status, but without any obligations. By itself, it could still exist, but then who would be able to enforce those rights, and in what platforms? If a contrast to be drawn with environmental protection, then of course the goal is to protect the environment itself. When it comes to AI, what is the goal? To protect AI from what? Disassembly? Some criminal sanctions that are to be imposed. The AI does not understand these concepts. And of course, one of the reasons that we are protecting the environment is to protect ourselves. Because if the environment is destroyed, then our own habitats basically are also destroyed. For the AI, no such rule applies. So it's a very different scenario, a very different mindset that is also quite problematic to be translated. Now, the third option is a so-called halfway status, which would mean that existing legal terminology could be used, which is very beneficial because it does not require new construct, new legal regulation to be applied. We take our existing legal rules and then we apply them. So, of course, we have the abstract legal personalities. When you are creating a company, when you are registering a company, then that company will have a legal status under the domestic law, and that will have to be respected to a certain degree by other states as well, based on the idea of sovereignty and immunity. However, this will also mean that these companies are having limited legal personalities, and they will have individuals who will be making the decisions for the company in the form of a board, in the form of a representative or agent. Now, for the AI, this would work basically the other way around, that the AI will act or could act in the name of the individual. Meaning that if I would like to have a treaty signed, I do not need to go to Mumbai or Beijing or Sao Paulo, but the AI will be able to either make the trip for me, or I will enable the AI to sign contracts in my name. However, this does have a lot of advantages and disadvantages as well. The AI can receive rights and obligations as it befits their functions. If I want them to do my groceries, then they will do it. If I want them to sign my contracts, then I will bestow such legal personality on them as to enable their functions. The negative aspects of it is that others might not know what the rights and obligations of that AI is. So, of course, it is much more complex to sign a treaty or sign a contract, to be more precise, than to do groceries. It is not written on the AI what its functions are or how separated its legal personality is from the owner. For companies, we usually have a suffix or a prefix after the name of the company that tells us something about the nature of the legal personality. Of course, this could be applied to AI as well. However, what happens when the AI overreaches or it does more than it was supposed to do, or it creates an accident while it is doing my groceries? Is it going to be responsible or not? And if so, then how? Because the if the AI is, for example, breaching the law, or it is found shoplifting because it fears that I'm poor and I cannot buy something, so it will help me sustain myself by, for example, shoplifting, is the criminal responsibility belonging to the AI or me or the one who has programmed and manufactured the AI? Is it responsible for the damages that it is causing? And if so, then how can these be enforced? AI does not understand our concepts of a prison sentence. It does not understand the death penalty. It does not understand humility or humiliating punishment or treatment. So these human concepts cannot be translated to the AI. So out of these three possibilities, this halfway status seems to be the easiest to use, but it still raises lots and lots of questions that are currently unanswered. And by the way, I do believe that most in academia are promoting this sort of halfway status for the future. A few years ago, it was to bring them into the fold and to provide them with some sort of legal personality, but this halfway status is what is currently getting more popular. And for the future, just to provide some predictions on what we can expect in the future when we reach the general AI stage or even the collective consciousness stage, we can treat it, according to our current understanding, as a special status under international law, a so-called sui generis status of having its own regime. It is not unheard of. We have similar regimes for the moon, for the regarding Antarctica or the UNESCO World Heritage List. So this is something that exists. And as we can see from the development of our regulation on outer space, this regulation can be very rapid. So this can evolve in a matter of 1 or 2 years, even if there is a sufficiently strong consensus on the international level. So this is possible, but it is currently a futuristic idea. So what are the current regulations or the current initiatives at regulating? We have, of course, we have hundreds of initiatives. This is not a full list. This is just a few interesting ideas on the way to move forward. One of the key players in this field, or the entity that tries to be a key leader, is of course the UN, where specialized agencies, especially UNESCO, is trying to regulate the process. The UN is having its own research center as well. And the UN is understanding in this issue, it is linking it with the Sustainable Development Goals. So they are saying that a reliable, transparent AI is required to ensure the well-being of mankind. And since that is one of the primary goals for the UN to ensure the not just political growth, but the economic growth of humanity, they are understanding this from the development standpoint. For the EU, they had the Robolo project back in 2014. That was one of the first in trying to ascertain whether some sort of regulation is necessary. But the EU is also understanding it from an economic standpoint. So from the point of view of the consumers, from data protection, from responsibility. And in that context, they had an expert document that was discussed by the European Parliament and the Commission, which said that legal personality from the point of view of responsibility is not necessary at this moment. And I think this is a keynote to take away, and it also highlights the mindset of the regulator. If it is not necessary to regulate, then we should not regulate it. So we are now at this point. AI has not reached the sufficient level of development to be regulated, but that will change in the future. So that is why it is good to have some research centers that are providing knowledge on the issue. On the universal level, there's also, of course, the OECD, that is having a fantastic set of regulations on the ethics and transparency of AI. The International Committee of the Red Cross is, as I mentioned, creating a draft treaty on the autonomous weapon systems. And there are hundreds of NGOs and scholars that are advocating some sort of research and cooperation. There are several NGOs whose sole function is to view how the regulation is shaping in the various states. So there are roughly 200 individual AI regulations that currently exist in these states, and they are trying to make, let's say, find a common ground, a common denominator when it comes to the regulation. But so far, this is still in its infancy. So what about the feasibility? Just to draw some conclusions, as I see that the time is slowly running out. It is not likely that we're going to see some international legal personality regulation in the near future. Of course, later on, it could become possible if the political will is maintained. Having an international treaty is, I think, quite unlikely, as it would be the cleanest way to regulate, but this would require the most consensus and the most political will when it comes to the conduct of states. We can have international customary law that can develop very rapidly if the conduct of states are converging towards the same direction. That is, I think, most likely to happen, as it does not require a punctual regulation that is adopted by the vast majority of states. So where do we go from here? We can have the domestic regulations shaping up, and it will create tension among states if the domestic regulations will be quite divergent. We'll see some sort of sectoral development as well, as opposed to general. We'll see some areas which are very important for the international community, like, for example, responsibility of the self-driving vehicles, or the intellectual property. That is most likely to develop faster than all the other fields, as it is in the interest of the states and of the regional groups and of the international community to be regulated to maintain economic growth. We will see technical growth that is absolutely certain to happen. Ethical dilemmas are currently analyzed and seen quite broadly, and legal regulation, as always, is lagging a bit behind. So this is our role and our responsibility, I think, to help with this process. And let's not forget that our current understanding and how we want to regulate AI is based on the anthropomorphic mindset. So we understand everything from the point of view of humans, as we are humans. However, AI is a very different thing. It is not at all human, although it was created by us. It is not an evolution that it is going through. It is a development process that is guided, that is led continuously. So it will have a much different evolutionary process, for a lack of a better expression, than AI, and it should be understood in a different context than humans. So this will require some self-reflections on our part. Now, if we were to regulate it, of course, there are several advantages. We can have the pooled research capabilities of several countries, which can benefit the individual regarding medical sciences, automated work processes, the restructuring of the labor market. But let's not forget that the unregulated development will also have its dangers. If it's only the 15% danger that the surveys have predicted that AI development will have a negative or even catastrophic outcome, then that is still a lot of chance to be led, or to be had for negative consequences. So we should heed the words of Stephen Hawking and Elon Musk, who said that some sort of unregulated AI is going to be quite dangerous. This is my last slide. I promise. So first, if we are to regulate, this is just a very quick sketch for the would-be regulators, as I assume that among you there are several future MPs and lawmakers who will guide this process in the future. First, we have to discuss what kind of AI do we have. The current one, some general AI, or some sort of consciousness by the time that we get there. Then we have to discuss or decide whether we have the political will to have international regulation. If not, then only domestic regulation is possible. If there is some political will, then we have to decide what type of regulation can we agree on. So do we have some sectoral one? Do we have a true international, a universal regulation one? And then if it comes to, for instance, collective consciousness, we have to decide whether we have time to regulate at all, or there is an urgency that requires more than some sort of international cooperation. So these are the types of questions that we have to ask ourselves before regulation. Regulation, I think, will happen, but what kind and what type of regulation will depend on a lot of different factors. But hopefully, you will be the ones who will be leading that charge. And with that, I think I have exhausted my time frame, so I will yield the floor back to Professor Kasia. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Andras Hars. This has been a wonderful talk, and let me summarize for all of you. Professor has talked about the development of artificial intelligence and how international law specifically can address this issue. And he pointed out that we do not have a specific treaty in this area. We have some soft law documents, we have some interventions from NGO. We have a lot of researchers who are working in this area, and he has very crisp understanding of how lawyer understand, how we can understand artificial intelligence in language, right? Because as a lawyer, we are not computer scientists. So he has given a very brief and very clear understanding of how we should understand as a lawyer that artificial intelligence is. And it's a thing which is created by human beings. So when we are deciding about what could be the personality of artificial intelligence, we have to reflect on first, what are the various personalities and possibilities that we already have? Does artificial intelligence fit on the existing personalities that we have? So he has given the possibilities through his propositions on the possibility to treat it as inanimate object, as an animal, or as a corporate entity having juristic personality, or is it a possibility to have a very different personality? I was reading an article and I found that I think European Union has done something in this area wherein they are treating artificial intelligence as artificial personality. They are giving some different personality to it apart from the existing jurisprudence that we have. So it's possible that we can regulate it. And there are a lot of possible questions because the existing laws are there that we have to address. The AI are sectoral laws. So we have a lot of sectors wherein artificial intelligence is applied, like in research, IHL, human rights. We are having the use of artificial intelligence extensively in the legal practice. So all those issues arise from the sectoral practices. So we have received some questions from students. So I begin with some questions that we have that could be addressed as per the international law. And they are very international in nature. Like one of the aspects is from data protection laws. So the student wants to know that how data protection law across the globe could address the problem of algorithms transparency.
Will we answer the questions one by one?
Yes.
Okay, let me say that I'm not a data protection expert, either on the European Union level or from an international standpoint. My take is that if we have data protection standards that can drive development in the way that it becomes a bit more transparent, and it builds not even respect, but trust in the people who are developing and building these systems, so that we know that they are the ones who are bound by these norms, that at least my personal files will not get on the internet and they will not be used by the AI when I do not provide my explicit consent for that. On the other hand, it can also limit regulation, because if we are constantly bound by data protection norms, then the machine learning process can be longer than the method by which the AI accumulates intelligence might also be distorted. Because if you are raising this question, it means that you have some knowledge on data protection by yourself. You might know that most of the people will just automatically click the consent forms, will allow all cookies, will allow all the terms and conditions to be automatically accepted. They're not as conscious. So if the conscious people, those who know what data protection is and those who are keen on protecting their own personal data, are excluded because they are bound by the norms on or protected by the norms on data protection, then it can have a distorted view from AI development. So once again, positive and negative aspects that need to be counterbalanced. But that is just my take, and I am not a data protection expert.
Yeah. So next question that we have is the use of artificial intelligence in judiciary and administrative practices. Do you think that there should be some restrictions over it, because it results in a lot of bias when we are using, and sometimes we are relying on machines?
Of course, the legal profession by itself is very colorful. So we have people who are dealing with corporate matters. We're dealing with judges and lawyers who are dealing with criminal matters, others with child protection, and so on. So these will require different AI systems to incorporate. For criminal law, for example, the bias is a real issue. They will have problems with, for example, racial profiling. When the AI has been used, for example, in airports, in most European and North American countries, they found that the AI algorithms are moving towards darker skinned people to be much more suspicious, and they were stopped based on the AI's recommendation. For prison, for example, there was an AI algorithm that was used on the US prisons, and they said that based on the general population and on the population that is being in prison in the US, that Black people are more likely to commit crimes than white people. Of course, this is a gross oversimplification of the processes, but if we rely purely on AI, this will also mean that the logical conceptualizing element that is a necessary component for decision makers and for future regulators is going to be missing. So I think that based on our current level of development, using the AI for simpler things are very nice, but using it to do the decision-making part for us is currently out of reach. So that is the brief answer to be.
Very true. Very true, because thankfully we are not using AI as of now in our Indian judiciary. We are using it for some administrative practices, but not in judiciary. For cause listing and case filings, we are using this, but it is having some limited practice. Another question that we have is from student, that how AI can help in making international policies. Is it really a possibility?
It is. It is, by the way, and those AI research centers that are dealing with AI are also using some sort of AI. So when you are comparing and contrasting the roughly 200 different domestic regulations on AI policy, for example, then you do not have to manually create an Excel sheet and then just put in the most important things. You will have to look for some certain keywords, because this is one of the positive elements of the legal profession, that that we are using the same expressions basically everywhere. So when the regulator is attempting to regulate, they will have a vast pool of knowledge that was created from these AI systems that will know how and when it is regulated. Of course, if let's say out of the 200 states, roughly 150 are having the same sort of regulation, at least on the level of principles, then that means that we have some sort of common understanding. So when we're drafting an international document, for example, that it be an international treaty or just a soft law agreement, then we will have a much easier job. And that is why these NGOs, for example, or these think tanks and research centers can be as productive and active as they are, because they do have these tools available for them, and they can have a prognosis on how AI is going to develop. So yes, it is used. It is used quite extensively, and it can create some sort of policy ramifications. And by the way, just to combine it with the previous questions, we do have AI algorithms that can also predict the outcome of a case in court. So that is something that also exists. If we feed the correct data into the algorithm, then it can tell by I think it was roughly between 80 and 85% probability what the outcome of that case will be in court. Of course, that is far from perfect, but we are getting there. So even regarding the legal profession, we can see some sort of trends emerging when it comes to AI.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Hars. So due to paucity of time, we will not be able to take more questions. And this has been a very wonderful session. And on behalf of Institute of Law, Nirma University, I'm very thankful to you for such an enlightening talk. And I hope the students will do more research and will read more about artificial intelligence and how the things are developing, as well as the today's topic, which has been very new, because very less has been written in this area as to how artificial intelligence would be addressed by international law. So thank you very much, Professor Hars, to share your views in this area. So we come to end of this webinar. So to deliver the vote of thanks, I would like to invite my student Kirtika Shukla, who has been a rapporteur for this webinar. Kirtika, are you there?
Digant sir, please give Kirtika the co-host rights. Meanwhile, Professor Hars, we would also like to invite you for another session on AI and law that we have today evening. And it is at 6 o'clock our time. And if it suits you, we would really like you to be part of the session. And it's been taken by Mr. Steve Robinson, and he has he was special advisor to the U.S. Department of Education. So if you are interested and if you have the time, please do join us for the session.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm not certain, because I think that's in roughly 3 hours, and I will be on a train then. So if my internet connection allows, then I will be very happy to join it. Of course, I do know the professor, because he was also there in person 3 years ago at NIRMA, and we have shared some very nice discussions. If I could just have one last thing to say for students specifically, because for a lot of fields in the legal profession, you basically have a complete system. You can argue whether what the amount of child support can be, how many sick leaves you should have regarding labor norms, but AI is basically a blank slate. You can do research, you can have a policy, and we do not have a way to know where it will go. So this will have lots and lots of opportunities for you. If you are brave enough to delve into this research, then you will have lots of opportunities. But I think that my dear colleague will touch upon these issues during the evening session as well. So thank you very much for the opportunity to be here.
Yeah, over to Kritika.
Good afternoon, everybody. I, Kirtika, on behalf of Institute of Law, Nirma University, would like to thank Dr. Andras Hars for taking out time from his busy schedule and gracing us with his presence. The discussion on AI and its entanglement with international laws and the intricacies attached was truly enlightening. Further, I'd like to thank our Dean and Director, Dr. Madhuri Parikh, for providing us this great learning opportunity. Additionally, I'd also like to thank our moderator for the event, Professor Amit Kashyap, for facilitating the discussion so wonderfully, and the head of International Office, Institute of Law, Nirma University, Shreya ma'am, and the whole ITM team for putting in tremendous effort to make the series such a big success. I'd also like to thank the faculties for taking out time from their busy schedule and always being a supportive factor. The biggest thanks goes to the student section, ILNU, for being the backbone of all these events and making sure that they're conducted in this online setup so smoothly. Last but not the least, a big thanks to the wonderful audience for being so supportive and making the session interactive. We look forward to many such discussions, sir.
Thank you, Kritika. So we come to end of this session. Thank you, Professor Hars, for being here.
My pleasure, and hope to meet again.
Yeah, same here.
Thank you, Professor Hars, and we'll see each other on 19th again.